if you are actually interested in having a copy of the slides or any of the stuff I've actually written around plain packaging and now also vaping, please just Google Sinclair Davidson plain packaging resources, and you'll be able to get a page on my blog site which covers all of the stuff, including these notes tonight. So if you just Google my name, plain packaging resources, and it will all be up there in all its glory. Now, we all know what plain packaging is. We've moved from a fully branded packet of cigarettes of, in this case, Marlboro, in the early 1990s, all the way through to this packet here at the end. It's the same brand of cigarettes, you just wouldn't think so. They've replaced all the producer branding with a olive green colour. It's not allowed to be called olive green in Australia because the Olive Growers Association complained bitterly. So it's actually called drab brown. But so that particular colour, and of course what I call medical pornography, has increased in size over the packet as well. Please note, however, the medical pornography first started in 2006. This is actually an important part of the story. The plain packaging reform actually had two changes. One, got rid of all the producer branding, and two, increased the size of the medical pornography on the packet of cigarettes. But I just want to start off very quickly by talking about the tobacco control industry. We have to understand tobacco control is an industry and should be thought of as an industry, and particularly should be thought of as a bureaucracy, and they have precisely the same motives and objectives as all bureaucrats, and that is to increase their budget, to increase their employment, to be seen to be working, to control people's lives, the kind of things we would expect from any kind of bureaucracy. The other thing to understand, certainly in Australia, the tobacco control industry is not about stopping people from smoking. The tobacco control industry is about, of course, prolonging their employment opportunities, and of course, ultimately also to destroy the legal tobacco industry. That seems to be what they're really on about, not actually stopping people from smoking. And of course, this particular industry is currently undergoing disruption itself from things such as vaping, heat not burn, and all the very innovative products that the tobacco industry itself is bringing out at the moment. Now, the way in which they describe what they are doing is certainly they use a combination of medical terminology and then economic terminology in order to confuse and obfuscate. So the medical terminology is smoking is a disease, it's an epidemic. And of course, diseases and epidemic need to be eradicated. And in this particular model of the world, the optimal level of smoking is 0. But they use economic language of externalities and internalities and this sort of thing. But of course, in economic terms, the optimal level of smoking is not 0. If you are rationally addicted, you should continue to smoke. If you are irrationally addicted, well, that's a problem. But we overcome those sorts of problems through taxation and public education. So we need to think that the optimal level of smoking is not 0. Now, the way in which I've done this, I've presented this model several times before, but just very quickly, when thinking about any regulation, you need to trade off the costs and benefits of disorder against the costs and benefits of dictatorship. And of course, disorder is the bad things people do to themselves and to each other, and dictatorship, of course, is the bad thing government does to us. So we need to trade off these costs and benefits, and I'm happy to talk about this particular model later on. But just what I want to get into tonight is the plain packaging debate has suffered from what Harold Demsetz described as the nirvana fallacy. Now, there are three things which make up the nirvana fallacy. The first one is people will be different after an introduction of a policy. 2, the grass will be greener on the other side. After we've introduced the policy, of course it worked, because if it wasn't a good policy that was going to work, we wouldn't have thought of it. And then finally, there can be free lunches, which is also their zero cost regulation. Now, the people could be different. The notion here is always that somehow it is bad, naughty, nasty industry that is doing all these bad things to us. And the thing you need to understand here is that industry satisfies demand. It doesn't create demand. So people want to smoke, or they want to drink alcohol, or they want to consume sugar, or they want to do all these terrible things because it's fun, because they enjoy it. Yeah, that's just the way it is. And Mises made the argument we shouldn't blame businesses that people prefer to read detective stories to Bibles and so on and so forth. Then we get to the grass is greener on the other side. Now, it's very important to understand when at first you don't succeed, you don't try again, you cheat. You make it up. You change the rules. And the tobacco industry has done this when it comes to plain packaging. Now, just some tobacco consumption in Australia has been in long-term decline for decades. Policy doesn't seem to matter very much. This is the last, up until 1990, so almost 3 decades now, of data, smoking data, that's the blue line, and then all the policies that have come in over this time. And then I've added in a trend line. And more or less, there's been very little deviation from the trend line. These policies don't seem to add much value. When you point this out to the tobacco industry, they say things like, oh, we are reinforcing the decline. Of course, that's what you say when you've got no story. Now let's talk about the objectives of plain packaging. The primary objective is to improve public health by decreasing the prevalence of smoking. And that's what the top half of it says. This is from the actual legislation. How they are going to do this is by making the packets unattractive and by attracting attention to the graphic health warning. So please remember, the objective here is to increase public health, to improve public health. There's a lot of stuff that I could talk about this, but tonight I just want to concentrate on 3 things. The first thing is the 3.4% lie. The second thing is the Cancer Council of Victoria surveys that were commissioned by the federal government. And the third thing is the post-implementation review study that came out. Now, in 2014, debate broke out in the Australian newspapers about the extent to which this policy had succeeded. And people were toing and froing and arguing and what have you. And then one fine day, one of the government's go-to journalists leaked the story that Treasury had gotten involved in the debate, and they had released secret data showing tax payments on excise had gone down by 3.4% in the first year of which the policy was announced. I followed the story quite closely because it was very interesting, the newspaper article, because no Treasury official was named. No Treasury official was quoted. No Treasury document was cited. These numbers just appeared out of nowhere, and questions were asked in the Parliament, freedom of information requests went in, and ultimately Treasury was required to release this secret information. And when you looked at the secret information and you adjusted for when the policy was actually introduced, and you adjusted for the fact that refunds were paid on tobacco products that were non-compliant and what have you, rather than going down by 3.4%, that actually increased by 0.5%. Okay? So you then asked the Treasury officials, what do they say? And they said, look, you know, we're not happy to add back the tax refunds because we can't be sure why we gave those tax refunds to the tobacco industry. So we're invited to believe that in a modern democracy, a tax state like Australia wrote checks refunding money to companies and didn't really know why they were doing this. It's never happened to me, but when it does, I will be very pleased. The health department are even more brazen. They actually came out and said, you know, we don't really believe at all that this data is an indication of consumption. Of course, they told everybody that it was, right up until they got caught out. So the French experience, last week an article came out in the French newspapers basically saying exactly the same thing. Tax data receipt seems to indicate that demand for cigarettes has gone up in France since this was introduced. Now this is still very early days, but at least the French haven't actually lied like the Australian authorities did. Oops, there we go. The Cancer Council of Victoria was commissioned, and I'll put commission in scare quotes because it's not quite clear how they came to be doing the research. But the Cancer Council of Victoria commissioned to undertake some research, and after freedom of information requests, the research contract between the federal government and the Cancer Council came out. And they were required to investigate immediate effects and distal effects. They had to investigate quit intentions, quit attempts, and they had to have a look at the independent and combined influences of plain packaging and the graphic health warning. So please remember the bits in red that I have indicated there. The results of these studies, of this survey, was published in the Tobacco Control of 2015. A lot with the other stuff, and the conclusion out of all of these studies was that this was a casebook example of effective control, rigorously tested and assessed. There were 3 important studies that they did, which my colleague Ashton De Silva and I investigated, and we found lots of evidence of cherry picking, data snooping, strange regressions where there were variables included that made no sense. When you drop them out, all of a sudden their significant results disappear. Subtle differences in methodology across the studies, and timing changes, and all sorts of things that when we unraveled all of it, all of their results more or less fell apart. So it's not robust. The Cancer Council responded to our paper, which is currently a working paper on the Social Science Research Network, also available on my page for you to have a look at. They put out a press release that was longer than our original paper. This is the money quote. Now, the bits in red are actually what they emphasized, and the italicized is what they emphasized. So the emphasis is all theirs. Now, I'm going to read it out in full. The survey was quite explicitly not designed to assess quitting success or change in smoking prevalence. Contrary to their research contract that they had with the federal government and the legislation, but rather focused on the immediate impact of the legislation on perceptions of the PAC, effects of health warnings and understanding product harmfulness. So people didn't like the packets. Unsurprising. Nobody would be surprised by this. They were specifically designed to be unattractive. I suppose the government got one thing right. So that's actually inconsistent. Now, what Ashton and I have done is written another paper which went up on SSRN just on Friday, where we actually undertake the analysis which the Cancer Council was supposed to have done, but claims that they never did. But it turns out they did something very similar. And this is a table that kind of shows that the plain packaging component didn't work at all, but that the graphic health warnings did. But what they've done here very cleverly is that they have truncated their sample to after the policy was introduced. So it turns out after the policy was introduced, people who saw the health warnings thought that they might quit. The results here and there have got the wrong sign. Okay, they are statistically significant, but they go contrary to what they were hoping to find. So, case proven, should we all go home? Well, the problem is they've only done after. So Ashton and I did the same analysis. We replicated their results before the policy came in, using their own data, and after the policy came in. There's our table, but you're not going to see that. So I've blown up the bits. Here are the results that they find. And what you find is people were motivated to quit smoking by the graphic health warnings before plain packaging came in. People were worried about the graphic health warnings they'd received before the policy came in. The 2006 policy is having the effect. There's no evidence that the 2012 policy is having any effect. The other result that we found, unsurprising, is people who are actually worried about their health more than they enjoy smoking also think about quitting. Not rocket science at all. So they did not become more effective after the introduction of the policy. As a matter of fact, the coefficients after the introduction of the policy are smaller than what they were before the policy came in. We did do some tests of the coefficients. Are they statistically significantly smaller? But alas, they aren't bigger. And the whole idea for the policy to be declared successful is that they must be bigger, and in actual fact they are smaller, but not statistically smaller. Then came out the post-implementation review. Now, they must have known this story was rubbish because they actually implemented original research to go into the post-implementation review. Mike Daub, who is a friend of yours, I think. I've seen he often says horrible things about you. I don't know. This is the man who tried to ban government funding for the play Carmen, the opera Carmen, because Carmen takes place in a cigarette factory. So we're actually talking about a serious ideologue here. Okay, it was such an appalling state of affairs, even the Australian government said, no, we think that's a step too far. But anyway, he on the day it came out, he put out a press release saying, it's especially rewarding that this meticulous independent analysis attributes part of that decline to plain packaging alone. They commissioned research from an American lady who had actually already worked for the Australian government, as an advisor in its WTO case. So she's already on the payroll. But yeah, independent analysis says due to plain packaging alone. Dr. Chipty, in her analysis, says it's impossible to identify the separate effects of plain packaging and the enlarged and updated graphic health warnings. So she directly contradicts what he's just said. But nobody picked it up, well, apart from me. But there was this diagram in the analysis. This is smoking prevalence from 1990 using monthly data from the Roy Morgan Index all the way up to September 2015. And she shows there is a change in trend. This change in trend was quoted all over Australia, including in the Parliament. And when I finally got the data, what she had done was retrofitted those trend figures in there to show that effect. There is actually no trend. There is no break in that data around the introduction of plain packaging. The only structural break that Ashton and I can find is in November 2004. So what she literally did was truncate the data, fit a trend part on some of it, and then fit a trend part on the other part of it. I mean, data snooping, that is profoundly dishonest in my view. She then did additional analysis, which unfortunately we haven't been able to get the data. We put in freedom of information requests, we were just told no. Her particular model there had 800,000 observations and 52 explanatory variables, but somehow didn't include price. Okay, so the price of cigarettes has got no impact on smoking prevalence in her model. Some of the variables are on the cusp of statistical significance now. There's something called Lindley's paradox, which the bigger the size of your sample, your asymptotes and all sort of things, you tend to find more statistically significant variables at conventional levels. You've got to adjust for that. She has an unusual base case as her example in the model. So her base case is an unmarried Australian-born 14 to 17-year-old male who has a tertiary education, employed full-time, with an income of less than $6,000 living in Victoria. Okay. If you found such a person, now it should be the case, strictly speaking, when you rebase your analysis, all the results should simply adjust. So it should be invariant to your base case, but that is such an unusual case that I would like to actually test. Why nobody ever called the police? I mean, it is illegal to employ somebody at $6,000. A 17-year-old with a university degree. Look, I don't want to judge, but she finds, however, over a 3-year period that there's a 0.55% decline in smoking prevalence off the trend that can be attributed to plain packaging. And that's what everybody was jumping up and down about. But you go onto the website and you look at Roy Morgan data, their sample error is 0.6%. So she has found an effect smaller than the sample error in the data. Which of course she didn't report at all. I had to go and find that out myself. Her pseudo R-squareds are very small, less than 10% in most instances. And I would also, if I had this data, I would also do a hit-miss table, because in some of the other analysis that I did for the other, the Victorian Cancer Council studies, very often the hit-miss tables had a 100% miss rate in some of their models. They actually got it completely wrong. So they can't explain more than 90% of the variation in the data, despite having 52 explanatory variables. And the data is not available for publication. So the grass is not greener. The policy has not worked by the criteria they set themselves in the Act, in the contract. But what has happened? So can we have consequence-free bad legislation or regulation? And the answer is no. So the cigarettes demand has gone to what we in Australia call cheapies. Okay, very, very low price cigarettes. So a packet of cigarettes might cost you, a premium pack might cost you about $30. So £15, I think, would be rough and ready, the kind of, 2 to 1 more or less. And that's going to go up to $40 by the time the current round of excise increases go up. So a lot of people are now, companies are selling $13 packets of cigarettes. People go into stores and say, what's the cheapest pack you've got? Okay, so that's happened there. The other thing's happened, the increase in criminality. Illicit tobacco has increased very dramatically from the introduction to today, and that's KPMG figures. So increases in criminality, but of course criminality in and of itself isn't a problem. Criminality is a gateway drug to further criminality. There are actually bad consequences of criminality. So they don't pay taxes. Now, that's not such a bad thing necessarily. But bear in mind, tobacco excise tax is the 9th largest single source of revenue to the Australian federal government. So I want to say federal. People have explained to me that my accent, I say feral. Federal. They don't pay taxes, but more importantly, they don't pay dividends. They engage in violence. A tobacco executive who was working with the authorities to clamp down on illegal tobacco was actually kidnapped. I don't know if you have kidnappings often in the UK, but in Australia this is like shocking criminal behaviour. Increases insurance costs for small retailers, because obviously now cigarettes are very valuable on the black market, and there's been a lot of criminal behaviour where people actually literally steal cigarettes. Criminals subvert societal institutions, and they compete illegally or unfairly with legal business, but there is I haven't put it on the slide, there is an upside. It turns out that a lot of criminals are actually substituting away from smuggling harder drugs to smuggling cigarettes, because the profit margin is much higher now and the costs of being caught. The sanctions are lower for smuggling cigarettes as opposed to others. We'll jump over that one. Okay. Why is this really a problem? I mean, a lot of people say, you know, we just don't care about cigarettes and tobacco companies. Okay, that's fine. But of course, this is an attack on intellectual property. This is a taking of the government. The Australian High Court actually said that the government, our government, did not have to pay compensation for this taking, because while they were taking the brands away from the companies, they weren't going to use them themselves. Okay, so I thought, well, that's fine. Can you imagine if the federal government were to set fire to Chief Justice French's house? Okay, they would be taking it away from him, but they wouldn't be taking it for themselves. They wouldn't have to pay him compensation under his own logic, which is a bit strange. But so it's an attack on intellectual property, an attack on investment. And of course, there are other products, sugar, alcohol, toys. Some toys in Australia have been put into plain packages. Computer games in South Australia were put into plain packages because people might be upset by the violent images. Fast food. And we need to be aware that government has taken control over the entire marketing mix of an entire industry. And there's no reason to believe that they're going to stop there. So, that's my story. Thank you very much.